Vivian Blackwood did not bother to look closely at the man in the worn jacket standing near the glass entrance of her company. All she saw was a poor single father, grease on his hands, shoes faded from years of walking, and an unsettling calm in his eyes that did not belong in a place like this. In front of a room full of investors, she pulled a $1 bill from her pocket, threw it to the floor, and said in a voice cold enough to freeze the air, "Take it and get out of my deal." Callum Vance simply bent down, picked up the bill, and smiled. Before midnight, the same mind behind that smile, a mind with an intelligence score of 192, would be the only thing standing between her and the collapse of a $7.3 billion acquisition. If you love watching arrogance meet its match, tap subscribe now so you never miss the moment pride finally runs out of places to hide. The lobby of Blackwood Meridian rose 3 stories of glass and polished steel in the heart of Manhattan, and on this particular afternoon it had been transformed into a stage. Blacktown cars lined the curb, security teams whispered into their sleeves, and a wall of cameras waited for the moment Vivian Blackwood would step forward to announce the acquisition of Helion Grid, a quantum energy firm whose technology promised to rewrite the rules of the power industry. Reporters clustered near a digital board that displayed the number 7.3 billion in crisp white letters, and lawyers in tailored suits moved through the crowd like conductors before a symphony. Everything about the room had been built to project wealth, precision, and control, and Vivian intended to stand at the center of all 3. She had spent 18 months chasing this deal, and today it would finally belong to her name. Every handshake, every late-night phone call, every compromise she had swallowed to keep the board united behind her had led to this single afternoon, and she intended to savor every second of it exactly as she had planned. Nothing, she believed, could interrupt a moment this carefully engineered. Callum Vance arrived into that engineered perfection like a wrench dropped into a watch. He wore a jacket that had seen better winters, carried a battered toolbox, and had been called in that morning to repair a faulty climate control panel inside the conference room where the signing would take place. His access badge, issued through a maintenance subcontractor, failed to scan at the private entrance, and within seconds, 2 guards had positioned themselves in front of him as though he were a threat rather than a technician trying to do his job. A few of the arriving guests glanced his way and assumed he had wandered in from the street, mistaking his patience for confusion and his stillness for helplessness. He tried, calmly and without raising his voice, to explain that he had been sent to fix the ventilation system before the ceremony began. Vivian noticed the commotion from across the lobby, already strained from a morning of last-minute negotiations and a board that wanted the ink dry before sunset. When she approached and heard Callum repeat his explanation, her patience, already thin, snapped entirely. Blaine Ashcroft, her chief financial officer, leaned toward her and murmured that a man like this loitering near the cameras could embarrass the company in front of every outlet covering the signing. It was a small remark, almost offhand, but it landed exactly where Blaine intended it to land. Vivian turned to Callum with the practiced disdain of someone who had spent her whole life sorting people by the cut of their clothes, reached into her bag, and pulled out a $1 bill. She threw it toward his feet in front of everyone gathered in that lobby, telling him this was surely what he wanted, and that he should take it and disappear from her deal before he ruined it further. Laughter rippled through the nearby guests, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of laughter that costs nothing to the people making it and everything to the person absorbing it. Callum did not raise his voice or argue his case. He crouched down, picked up the bill between 2 fingers, and slid it into his jacket pocket as though it were something worth keeping, rather than something meant to wound. In that brief moment of stillness, his eyes drifted past Vivian's shoulder to a monitor displaying a preview of the signing documents, and one line near the bottom of the caught his attention in a way nothing else in that lobby had. The line read Contingent Liability Transfer Clause, buried in small font beneath paragraphs of celebratory language about innovation and partnership. To anyone else in that lobby, it would have meant nothing at all. To Callum, it was the first loose thread in a garment that looked flawless from a distance but had been stitched together with something rotten underneath. He said nothing. He simply filed the detail away, the way he had once filed away thousands of anomalies in financial models during a career most people in that room would never know he'd had, and allowed the guards to guide him toward the service corridor without resistance. The corridor smelled of fresh paint and cleaning solvent, a stark contrast to the marble and champagne just beyond the double doors. Security walked Callum out with the same detached efficiency they might use to remove a piece of malfunctioning equipment, careful not to touch him, careful only to make certain he did not return to the areas reserved for people who mattered. He did not protest. He tucked the dollar bill deeper into his pocket, less as currency and more as evidence of exactly how little Vivian Blackwood had bothered to see him. In the quiet stretch of hallway near a service elevator, a handful of details about his life surfaced through nothing more than a short phone call. His daughter, Harper, 10 years old and staying with a neighbor after school, asked in a small voice whether he would make it home in time for dinner. Callum told her he would try, kept his tone soft so she would not hear the exhaustion underneath it, and ended the call before the silence between them could stretch any longer. He was, by every visible measure, an ordinary man doing an ordinary job to keep his daughter fed and housed, and the world outside that hallway had decided that ordinary was all he could ever be. While waiting for an escort back to the loading dock, Callum found himself positioned near an open door where Blaine Ashcroft stood speaking in a hushed but urgent tone with a silver-haired man later introduced to the room as Sterling Whitlock, chairman of Whitlock Capital. Their conversation moved carefully, the way conversations do when the people having them assume no one worth worrying about is listening. Callum caught fragments, a reference to Clause 14C, a mention of a valuation model that had been quietly adjusted, and a remark that once Blackwood signed, it would already be too late to undo the damage. He said nothing, gave no indication that he understood the weight of what he had just heard, and continued walking as though the words meant nothing at all. Passing a secondary monitor left active near an unattended workstation, Callum glanced at a preview of the technical data feeding into the acquisition model. It took him only seconds, the same seconds it might take another person to read a street sign, to notice that the revenue figures projected for Helion Grid did not align with the cash flow patterns embedded deeper in the file. Somewhere inside the architecture of that deal, someone had hidden a debt large enough to swallow the very company acquiring it. He pulled a crumpled receipt from his pocket, turned it over, and began writing a short sequence of equations on the back with the kind of fluency that suggested this was not the first time numbers had rearranged themselves into warnings before his eyes. He murmured to himself, almost too quiet to hear, that this was not a $7.3 billion deal at all. It was an $11 billion trap wearing a $7.3 billion mask, and no one inside that glass building seemed to know it yet except for the man they had just thrown a single-dollar bill toward. Callum made his way toward Eleanor Kingsley, Blackwood Meridian's lead counsel, a woman known throughout the firm for demanding evidence before sentiment. At first, she regarded him with the same dismissiveness everyone else had shown, assuming he was simply the maintenance worker causing the earlier disturbance in the lobby. But something in the way he spoke, precise, unhurried, entirely without the panic of someone bluffing, made her pause long enough to actually listen. He explained, in plain terms stripped of technical jargon, that the valuation model behind the acquisition had been inverted, with projected profits pulled forward artificially while environmental and technology-related liabilities had been pushed quietly into an appendix few people would ever read closely. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, not quite belief, but the early stirrings of doubt strong enough to be uncomfortable. Still unconvinced enough to act alone, she brought Callum through a side hallway to find Vivian, who by then was fielding a storm of pressure from board members, investors, and a media team eager for their headline before the evening news cycle began. When Eleanor introduced Callum and repeated his warning about the structure of the deal, Vivian let out a short, humorless laugh that echoed slightly against the marble walls around them. She told him, with the practiced cruelty of someone accustomed to winning arguments through status rather than substance, that if he were truly capable of understanding a deal this complex, he certainly would not be standing there in a jacket that looked pulled from a donation bin. It was a deeper cut than the dollar bill had been, aimed not at his finances but at his very right to be taken seriously. Callum did not defend his appearance or raise his voice to match her tone. He simply told her that he did not need her belief, only her attention, and asked that she review line 14C before signing anything. Blaine seized the opening immediately, accusing Callum of causing a disturbance and suggesting, without any real evidence, that a competitor might have paid him to disrupt the signing. Sterling Whitlock, standing nearby with the practiced ease of a man who had learned long ago how convenient other people's desperation could be, added with false gentleness that the poor sometimes did whatever it took to be noticed by people who mattered. The small crowd of executives around them absorbed the remark with quiet amusement, treating Callum as an inconvenience rather than a warning. Vivian ordered that Callum be kept away from the signing room for the remainder of the evening, her decision final, and delivered without a second glance in his direction. But as security began to move him along, he turned back just long enough to say one more sentence. Quiet enough that only Eleanor fully caught it. He told her that if Vivian signed at 11:59 that night, Blackwood's stock would fall 38% by morning. Eleanor felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the hallway, and she discreetly wrote the sentence down on the corner of a legal pad before following Vivian back toward the signing room, doubt now fully awake behind her calm expression. What neither woman knew yet was the full shape of the man they had just dismissed. Later that evening, working quietly at her desk while the ceremony continued down the hall, Eleanor pulled every background record she could find on Callum Vance, driven less by procedure and more by the unshakable feeling that his warning had not come from guesswork. What she found rewrote everything she thought she understood about the man in the worn jacket. Years earlier, Callum had been a mathematics prodigy at Stanford, later recruited by some of the most selective investment funds in the country, after posting a cognitive assessment score of 192, a number so rare it appeared only a handful of times in the records she was reading. He had built a risk analysis framework early in his career known within certain financial circles as the Rook Index, a tool so precise that firms paid enormous licensing fees simply to run their acquisitions through it. After the death of his wife, Callum walked away from that world entirely, unwilling to keep building wealth for people who treated numbers as more important than the human beings behind them. He remembered the exact week he decided to leave, a week spent inside a conference room much like this one, watching senior partners celebrate a merger that had quietly cost several hundred workers their pensions, toasting champagne over numbers that represented someone else's ruin. He had said nothing that day either, and the silence had followed him home and sat with him through every sleepless night afterward, until he finally understood that his gift could either serve people or be used to erase them, and he refused to spend the rest of his life choosing the second option. He took technical and maintenance work instead, jobs with fixed hours and no late-night calls, jobs that let him be present for Harper in ways his old career never would have allowed. He learned to fix furnaces and rewire panels the same way he had once learned calculus, methodically, patiently, treating every broken system as a puzzle worth solving carefully rather than rushing through. There was a kind of peace in that work he had never found on trading floors, an honesty in wires and valves that never lied about what they needed the way spreadsheets sometimes did. He had not vanished because he lacked ability. He had vanished because he had seen exactly what ambition, without conscience, could do to a person, and he wanted no part of raising his daughter inside that kind of hunger. Harper knew almost nothing of his old life, only that her father was quiet, steady, and always found a way to make the numbers on their kitchen table work out by the end of the month, and that had always been enough for both of them. Eleanor's search produced one detail sharp enough to steal the air from her lungs. The Rook Index, the very framework Blackwood Meridian relied upon to validate the Helion grid acquisition, had been quietly altered from its original design, its safeguards stripped down until it could be manipulated by anyone with enough access and enough motive. The only person alive who could recognize exactly how the model had been corrupted was the same man who built it from nothing, the man currently being escorted through a service hallway, like a trespasser. Back in the main hall, the ceremony pressed forward with theatrical precision. Cameras rolled, board members applauded on cue, and Vivienne stood beneath bright lights, announcing that Blackwood Meridian would acquire Helion Grid for $7.3 billion, framing the moment as the beginning of a new era in energy technology. Blaine hovered near her, urging her repeatedly to move quickly through the signing before hesitation could cost them the deal to a rival bidder. Sterling watched from a few rows back with the calm satisfaction of a man who already knew how the night would end, at least in the version of events he had spent months quietly engineering. As the final documents were prepared for signature, the internal risk monitoring system embedded within Blackwood's network triggered an unexpected alert, a sharp red warning flashing briefly across a secondary display near the stage. Blaine moved quickly, dismissing it as an unrelated malfunction tied to earlier maintenance work, subtly steering suspicion toward the very technician who had caused the scene in the lobby. Eleanor, still holding the words Callum had spoken only an hour earlier, insisted the signing be paused for 10 minutes so the alert could be properly reviewed. The pause placed Vivienne in an impossible position. Stopping now in front of cameras and shareholders risked making her look uncertain at the exact moment she needed to look unshakable. Signing anyway risked something far worse if the warning turned out to be real. Sterling used the hesitation like a scalpel, remarking loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear that perhaps Blackwood Meridian lacked the discipline required for a deal of this scale. It was a small, surgical insult, and it worked exactly as intended, tightening the pressure around Vivienne until her jaw clenched beneath her composed expression. By then, Callum had already left the building, sitting quietly in his aging pickup truck in the far corner of the parking structure, prepared to drive home and put the entire evening behind him. He had given his warning, been mocked for it, and decided he owed the people inside that glass tower nothing further. His phone rang before he could pull out of the space, Eleanor's voice on the other end asking him to come back inside. He hesitated, the sting of the dollar bill still fresh enough to feel physical, and told her he had already said what needed to be said. Eleanor did not apologize on Vivienne's behalf. Instead, she told him plainly that she was not calling to save her boss. She was calling on behalf of thousands of employees who would lose their jobs if this acquisition collapsed under the weight of a debt no one else could see. Something in that sentence reached him in a way pride and status never could have. He looked at the dollar bill sitting on the passenger seat where he had placed it earlier, exhaled slowly, and turned the truck back toward the entrance he had been thrown out of only hours before. When he walked back through those glass doors a second time, still wearing the same worn jacket, every camera in the lobby swung toward him as though sensing, even before anyone said a word, that the night was about to change direction entirely. He was brought into a private conference room sealed off from the cameras where Vivienne, Blaine, Eleanor, several board members, and representatives from Helion Grid now sat in tense silence. The air felt thick enough to cut, especially once it became clear that this was the very man Vivienne had humiliated with a $1 bill only hours earlier. Vivienne, still clinging to whatever authority she had left, told him coldly that he had 5 minutes to make his case. Callum did not flinch at her tone. He simply asked that someone pull up Appendix 14C, the restructured energy valuation table, and the clause governing legal liability transfer. Blaine interrupted repeatedly, insisting Callum had no evidence and no standing to be in that room at all. Callum ignored him, picked up a marker, and began writing directly across the glass wall, separating the private room from the hallway outside. Layer by layer, he unwound the model in front of them, showing that Helion Grid's revenue had been recorded 18 months earlier than it should have been, that maintenance liabilities for the aging power grid had been quietly shifted into a subsidiary designed to disappear after the acquisition closed, and that a hidden clause would leave Blackwood solely responsible for massive penalties if Helion's experimental technology ever failed to perform as promised. The room grew quiet in a way it had not been all evening. Eleanor cross-checked each claim on her laptop in real time, confirming one detail after another until her hands had gone slightly cold. For the first time since the ceremony began, Vivienne's composure cracked visibly. The confidence she had worn like armor all day suddenly looking thin and borrowed. Callum continued, explaining that if the deal closed under its current structure, Blackwood Meridian would not simply lose the $7.3 billion already at stake, but could face additional liabilities reaching into the billions beyond that. Sterling attempted a dismissive laugh, suggesting this was nothing more than speculation from an outsider who understood none of the real mechanics of high-level finance. Callum turned to him with the same unhurried calm he had carried since the moment the dollar bill hit the floor, and asked a single question that silenced the room entirely. He asked why Whitlock Capital had purchased a significant short position against Blackwood's stock earlier that afternoon, hours before any public sign of trouble had surfaced. Every eye in that conference room turned toward Sterling at once, the practiced charm on his face flickering for the briefest moment before he could rebuild it. Eleanor moved immediately, instructing her legal team to pull every derivative transaction tied to Whitlock Capital from earlier that day. The records confirmed exactly what Callum had implied, a substantial bet placed against Blackwood's stock hours before the acquisition had even reached its final signing stage. Evidence that Sterling had known disaster was coming long before anyone else in the room suspected a thing. Blaine's composure began to unravel, sweat gathering at his temple as the walls around his carefully built deception started closing in. Callum studied him closely, recognizing the specific kind of fear that comes only from knowing far more than one is willing to admit. He asked that the system's edit history for the valuation file be pulled up next. Blaine claimed the records were sealed and inaccessible on short notice, a claim Callum dismantled within seconds by pointing toward a backup directory embedded in the very software he himself had once built years earlier. The Rook Index, by design, silently logged every meaningful change made to its underlying variables, a safeguard Callum had installed long before Blaine or anyone else in that room had ever touched the system. When the log opened on the shared screen, Blaine's login credentials appeared attached to every suspicious alteration made to the model over the previous several weeks. Blaine tried weakly to argue that he had simply followed instructions passed down from Helion's own negotiating team. Callum offered one final, devastating detail, noting that each fraudulent edit had been made almost exactly 6 minutes after a private call between Blaine and Sterling, a pattern far too consistent to be coincidence. He pulled the call logs onto the screen beside the edit history, lining up the two timestamps side by side, so that even someone with no background in finance could see the pattern repeat itself 4 separate times over the previous 3 weeks. Eleanor asked quietly whether Blaine had been paid, and when he refused to answer, his silence became an answer of its own, heavier than any confession could have been. Vivienne stared at the man she had trusted with her company's finances for years, absorbing the reality that he had quietly sold her out to the very rival trying to destroy her. She thought back to the countless late nights he had stayed behind, with her reviewing quarterly numbers, the trips they had taken together to meet investors, the trust she had extended to him without ever once questioning it, and all of it now felt like a door she had left unlocked without realizing anyone had walked through it. The sharper pain, though far less visible on her face, came from realizing she had spent the entire day mocking the one person who had tried to save her from exactly this outcome, while the one she had trusted completely had spent that same day quietly building the very trap meant to bury her. Her eyes drifted briefly to the edge of Callum's jacket pocket, where the folded corner of a single dollar bill was just barely visible, and for the first time all evening she found herself with absolutely nothing to say. Just as the room seemed ready to treat Callum's work as finished, he spoke again, explaining that the deal did not need to die, only to be rebuilt before the clock struck midnight. A wave of disbelief passed through the room at the idea that a multi-billion-dollar structure could be redesigned in the few remaining hours before the exclusivity window expired. Callum proposed shifting the acquisition away from a full purchase of Helion Grid and toward controlled ownership of its core technological assets, isolating the toxic legacy debt into a separate entity while requiring Helion to remain financially responsible for the performance of its own technology over the next 5 years. It was an elegant reversal, turning what had been engineered as a trap into a structure that protected Blackwood while still delivering the innovation it had come for. Helion's legal team pushed back immediately, insisting no one could responsibly restructure a deal of this magnitude on such short notice. Callum answered simply that no one else in that room had built the very tool being used to value this transaction from the ground up, but he had. Eleanor confirmed the claim publicly, revealing to the stunned room that Callum was in fact the original architect of the Rook Index, the same system Blackwood had paid enormous licensing fees to use through a third-party vendor for years. Vivian absorbed the realization slowly, understanding now that her company's success had quietly depended for years on the intelligence of a man she had just humiliated in front of dozens of strangers. Sterling, sensing his carefully built plan collapsing in real time, threatened to pull every investor connected to Whitlock Capital out of any future dealings with Blackwood. Callum responded without raising his voice, pointing out calmly that withdrawing now would only draw sharper attention to the short position and the coordinated timing behind it, effectively confirming what everyone in that room already suspected about his involvement. Sterling's threat evaporated the moment he realized it would only tighten the noose already forming around him. Callum turned to Vivian one final time before the room could return to the chaos of preparation, asking her plainly whether she wanted to save the deal or protect her pride, because the next few hours would not allow room for both. What followed was not simply a negotiation but a quiet reckoning inside Vivian herself. Standing across from the man she had reduced to a $1 bill only hours earlier, she found herself, for perhaps the first time in her career, without the shield of status to hide behind. Callum did not raise the earlier humiliation to seek revenge, but he did not let it pass unspoken either, reminding her gently that the true cost of dismissing another person carelessly was rarely paid by the person doing the dismissing. Vivian offered an apology at first that still carried the clipped efficiency of a corporate statement, brief and procedural, more habit than sincerity. Callum did not accept it. He told her plainly that she had not insulted some hidden genius waiting to be discovered. She had insulted an ordinary father trying to earn an honest living, and that distinction mattered more than she seemed willing to admit. The words landed harder than anything said in that room all evening, and for the first time, Vivian fell completely silent, the practiced armor of her title offering no defense against a truth this simple. When she finally spoke again, in front of Eleanor and the remaining board members still gathered in the room, her apology carried none of its earlier polish, only the plain admission that she had judged him by his clothing, his posture, and his apparent place in the world rather than anything true about who he actually was. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between two people who had spent the entire evening on opposite sides of a line neither had expected to cross. Vivian finally asked, quietly enough that the rest of the room barely heard it, why he had come back at all, after everything she had done to him in that lobby. Callum answered simply that he had not come back for her. He had come back for the people whose jobs depended on decisions being made correctly, and that saving her company and forgiving her were two entirely separate things that did not have to happen at the same time. Callum agreed to help finish rebuilding the deal, but only under two conditions, he stated without hesitation. Blackwood Meridian would establish a protective fund for employees affected by future corporate restructuring, and Blaine Ashcroft would face a full, public, and lawful investigation into his role in the attempted sabotage. Vivian agreed to both without negotiation, something Eleanor noted internally as the first genuinely selfless decision she had seen her employer make all year. The atmosphere in the room shifted then, from open hostility to a tense, fragile kind of partnership neither of them had expected to find with the other. Callum picked up a red pen from the table and began marking the very first line of the $7.3 billion agreement, the sound of ink against paper the only noise left in a room that had spent the entire evening shouting. What followed became a race against a deadline that offered no mercy for exhaustion or doubt. If a revised agreement was not finalized before the exclusivity window closed at midnight, Helion Grid's technology would slip entirely into Sterling Whitlock's hands, undoing everything Callum had just fought to protect. Inside the glass-walled conference room, three very different people worked side by side with a shared sense of urgency that overrode every earlier tension between them. Callum rebuilt the valuation model line by line. Eleanor rewrote the legal language to close every loophole Blaine had exploited, and Vivian worked the phones tirelessly, holding her board members in place through sheer force of will as rumors began leaking outside the room. Sterling, unwilling to accept defeat quietly, leaked word to a handful of financial outlets that Blackwood's acquisition was unraveling behind closed doors. Word spread quickly enough that after hours trading on Blackwood's stock began swinging wildly, investors calling in a steady stream of anxious questions that threatened to overwhelm Vivian's composure entirely. For a brief moment, faced with the sound of her own company's value trembling in real time, she nearly lost her grip on the calm Callum had spent the last several hours helping her rebuild. Callum noticed something crucial buried inside Sterling's aggressive maneuver. A flawed assumption baked into every move the man had made that night. Sterling believed Blackwood remained locked into purchasing all of Helion Grid outright, unaware that the newly restructured agreement offered a cleaner, smarter alternative capable of restoring investor confidence rather than deepening the panic. If the market understood the new structure clearly, it would read not as desperation but as discipline, a company correcting course before disaster, rather than stumbling blindly into one. Convincing the board and the market of that distinction, however, would require absolute trust in a man Vivian had known for less than half a day. She made her decision standing at the head of that glass table, choosing to hand her company's reputation, and by extension her own, entirely into the judgment of someone she had once thrown a single-dollar bill toward like discarded trash. It was not an easy decision, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine every way it could still go wrong, the headlines that would follow if a man in a maintenance jacket turned out to be mistaken about a deal this large. But every instinct she had built over a decade of reading people told her the opposite was true, that the calm in his voice was not bravado but certainty, the kind of certainty that only comes from actually understanding something completely. Eleanor worked beside her without complaint through the final hour, her earlier skepticism long since replaced by a quiet, steady respect for the man who had walked back through those doors on his own terms, rather than staying away out of wounded pride. Board members called in one after another, some still uneasy, some outright hostile toward the idea of trusting an unknown technician with a deal of this size, but Vivian held the room together through sheer force of will, repeating the same steady line to each of them, that the numbers spoke for themselves, and the numbers had already been checked twice. The clock on the wall read 11:47 when Callum finally looked up from the final draft and said only 3 words: "Send the final version." The revised agreement went out to Helion Grid's leadership, and Blackwood's board within minutes, immediately drawing resistance from Helion's representatives, who realized the new structure no longer allowed them to hide their liabilities behind vague language. Vivian, guided by everything Callum had walked her through over the previous hours, refused to soften the terms under pressure. She told them clearly that Blackwood intended to acquire genuine innovation, not a carefully disguised falsehood dressed up as opportunity. Sterling made one final attempt to seize control of the situation, offering Helion's leadership a higher price in a desperate bid to steal the deal out from under Blackwood at the last possible moment. Callum had already anticipated the move and prepared a decisive counter, quietly pointing out that if Sterling stepped in now, he would inherit the very toxic debt he had spent months trying to conceal inside the original structure. In trying to seize the prize, Sterling would be forced to swallow the poison meant for someone else, the trap he built, finally closing around its original architect. Blackwood's board voted to approve the restructured agreement with very little debate remaining once the numbers were laid out plainly before them. The $7.3 billion deal did not collapse that night. It transformed instead into something safer, sharper, and considerably more advantageous than the version Vivian had walked in prepared to sign. Blaine Ashcroft was suspended on the spot, his downfall requiring no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet, unmistakable weight of everyone in that room finally seeing him clearly for the first time. Vivian turned to look at Callum one last time before the papers were sent for final filing. He reached into his jacket, removed the single-dollar bill she had thrown at his feet earlier that evening, and placed it gently on the table beside the finalized agreement worth billions. It sat there as a quiet, undeniable symbol, the very thing she had used to belittle him now resting beside the proof that her entire company had survived the night because of him. Callum looked at her steadily and told her simply that this was the best investment she had ever thrown away. By morning, financial outlets across the country were reporting that Blackwood Meridian had successfully closed its acquisition of Helion Grid under a dramatically improved structure. One analyst described as a masterclass in last-minute risk management. Rather than collapsing, Blackwood's stock climbed in early trading, a sharp contrast to the disaster Sterling had spent months quietly engineering behind the scenes. Regulators soon opened a formal inquiry into Whitlock Capital's suspicious trading activity from the previous afternoon, while Blaine Ashcroft faced the beginning of a lengthy legal reckoning for his role in falsifying the company's internal valuation model. Later that day, Vivian called an internal meeting attended by every senior leader within Blackwood Meridian. Standing before them, she made no attempt to claim credit for the events of the previous night. Instead, she introduced Callum Vance to the room as the company's newly appointed strategic advisor, the man whose insight had single-handedly prevented a $7.3 billion catastrophe. Callum did not immediately accept a permanent title, telling the room only that he would consider it, provided the company committed to changing the way it treated the people working in its lowest paid and least visible roles. Vivian agreed without hesitation, announcing the creation of a new training and advancement program specifically designed for maintenance staff, administrative workers, and technicians, the very employees most often rendered invisible inside corporations built around appearances rather than substance. She asked Eleanor to draft the framework that same week, insisting that it include real pathways into leadership roles, rather than symbolic gestures, meant only to look good in a press release. Several employees who had worked in the building for years, people whose names most executives had never bothered to learn, were invited to the first planning session, and for the first time many of them sat at a table they had only ever cleaned or repaired. It was a quiet ending rather than a triumphant one, grounded and sincere instead of performative, the kind of resolution that felt earned rather than theatrical. Word of what had happened that night spread slowly through the company, not as gossip but as something closer to a lesson, repeated in break rooms and hallways by people who had learned, in one way or another, that the value of a person had never been something a title or a paycheck could fully measure. In the final moments before Callum left the building, for what felt like the last time that day, Vivian handed him back the single-dollar bill. Only now it had been placed inside a small glass frame engraved with a simple line reading, "Never price a person before you know their value." Callum accepted it without ceremony, tucking it under his arm as he walked toward the exit, his phone buzzing once with a call from Harper, asking whether he had managed to fix the machine he'd been sent to repair. He looked back at the glass tower behind him, allowed himself a small, tired smile, and told her that yes, in fact, he had fixed something considerably larger than a machine. There is a particular kind of satisfaction found not in loud revenge but in quiet, undeniable proof, the kind that leaves an entire room of powerful people with absolutely nothing left to say. Callum Vance never raised his voice, never sought to humiliate the woman who had humiliated him first, and never once let anger dictate his choices. He simply let the truth of his worth speak for itself, and by the time the sun rose over Manhattan the next morning, everyone who had once laughed at a folded dollar bill understood exactly how wrong they had been to judge a man by the jacket on his back, rather than the mind underneath it.
Sounds compelling, though. Just finished the game for the first time, nearly done with the DLC.
Oh, this is
Oh, what, for Elden Ring or Wukong?
Discord.
I'm guessing you... Oh, you definitely mean Elden, because this doesn't have DLC.
Obsessions and guide them.
Is that what's on your mind, Whimsy?
For one as destined as you, there can be no turning back. We are like tumbleweeds, drifting